Now we have Windows. Okay, thank you. Sorry. In April and May 1936, Bolivian workers organized the country's largest to date strike wave, negotiating behind the scenes with senior military officers. They secured a promise that soldiers would not repress the movement, and then the military would ally them. And then on May 17th, there was a bloodless coup which took over the existing, not quite elected Bolivian government. And Generals Bush and Toro led this 3 year period of so-called military socialism, which, among other things, established union membership as a core form of Bolivian citizenship. And eventually, Bolivia's radicalized proletariat would secure some of the most expansive legal and social rights for union action anywhere in the world. And by the 21st century, urban and rural road blockades emerged in Bolivia as successors to the factory-centered general strike. In May 1936, energized by the let's do that one. Energized by the electoral victory of a four-party Popular Front, French workers embarked on a national general strike, occupying their workplaces nationwide. The Matignon agreements with the Popular Front government laid the foundations for the French and, by extension, Western European welfare state. In a country where revolts at the barricades were already a national tradition, the strike wave marked a rebirth of the uprising in national politics. May 1936 was also the first peak of the sit-down strikes in the United States, which would return with greater force in December, when a strike in the pivotal corporation General Motors began in Flint, Michigan. The 3 month GM strike was the turning point for the unionization of the American auto industry, arguably also the establishment of industrial unionism and the formation of a U.S. middle class. With the mechanism of when the mechanism of sit-down strike was criminalized in 1939, still the Congress of Industrial Organizations became a foundational part of American labor. So in France and the United States, workers engaging in factory occupations made occasional references to Polish strikes, linking their actions to miner and textile workers in Silesia, Łódź, and elsewhere in Poland. Their Polish workers had really innovated the sit-down or occupation strike in the prior 6 years. And while the direct legacy of those strikes was buried beneath the Nazi occupation and the Soviet-defined government that followed, direct action syndicalism through factory occupations would define several Polish uprisings and ultimately characterize the Solidarity movement of 1980 and 81, with Solidarność being nothing other than the moniker for the Interfactory Strike Committee. And then this image on the far left here, a Bolivian newspaper with a single photo, just titled On Strike and Huelga, with this caption: "This mask against asphyxiating gases is not carried by a soldier, nor by a militiaman, but a young North American on strike." And I present this and kind of the sheet that I found this in a Bolivian archive, as evidence of the ways that practices of direct action, impulse to workers' power, and their refusal to be cowed by violence can unite across distance and language, can precipitate ties of mutual affinity and inspiration. My theoretical reflection today attempts to similarly cross borders between cases I can only briefly sketch out in the time allotted, while raising questions about the meanings of ideologies of autonomy, the discourse of rights, and the ambiguous role of the state. So what I'm really grappling with here today is this overlap and interaction between a particular mode of action in the factory occupation that's gone across all these national contexts, and ideals of syndicalism and the left more broadly. And I'm going to be using syndicalism in this talk actually as a stand-in for various kinds of worker-centered anti-politics at a certain level. And so I'm including Catarismo, which is this very indigenous-centered tradition in Bolivia that has a profound skepticism of politics as a fundamentally colonized space, as a place in which right rule is inevitably perpetuated, in which there's a lot of corruption and buying out. So a kind of distrust of state-aligned leadership. And in the U.S., syndicalism, which animates IWW, is going to be succeeded by a different but still worker-centered ideology that is animating the Congress of Industrial Organizations, something that becomes half of the AFL-CIO. On the other side, from states, we have this really strange fact that in the 20th century, we have this transition from strikes being regarded as essentially criminal activities engaged in by workers to a fundamental part of international law. The right to strike is one of the very few rights that's in both the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, one of the few rights that's openly embraced, at least in public form, right, by the Soviet Union and the US, leading to these two documents having it. And so grappling with that like odd contradiction and the question of what does it mean for anti-political movement to stake a claim for a fundamentally state acknowledged right is kind of the thing that I'm grappling with today. So while through syndicalism, among other bottom-up ideologies, revolutionaries have articulated a grassroots ideology of workers' power, autonomy, and non-dependence on the state, I'm interested in how these perspectives emerge from and legitimate factory occupations and confrontational protest on the one hand, but I also want to highlight how the syndicalist critique of external representation is forced in practice to reconcile with official practices of recognition. Okay, so I have this section on direct action, which feels very redundant with things that people have said in the last hour. So I'm just gonna like do super highlights of this, right? I have this quote from Crime Think, which is a kind of now postmodern anarchist collective in the United States. Writing in 2004, they say, any action that sidesteps regulations, representatives, and authority to accomplish goals directly is direct action. And also, the opposite of direct action is representation. And so I feel like this is at least a particular kind of received wisdom about how to think through what we mean by direct action, but it assumes this like profound opposition to any form of negotiation and representation. And yet when people actually do direct action, they are doing these kind of complicated things. So this ideal of we will not ask, we will not demand, we will take and occupy, that has to be kind of reconciled in moments where there still is a state with, does the state regard your continued occupation of that factory as trespassing or not, right? Is there an agreement from a state like the Polish People's Republic to negotiate with Solidarity or to treat them as a criminal organization? And so what I first want to think about is the way that this acts as a form of theory that's grounded in practice, right? And so first I'm going to say general strikes are this practice, and then syndicalism emerges as a theory for understanding that power, proposing that ultimately workers should control the means of production through their own unions and organizations, with that control to be wrested through strikes and ultimately general strikes. But then conversely, there's this kind of collective action, like particular form of strike action that is really a crystallization of the syndicalist perspective, and it's these factory applications. So here we are in the early 1900s with the industrial workers of the world, this anarcho-syndicalist union in the United States. Prominent leader among them, Lucy Parsons, is going to propose at their founding convention this. My conception of the strike of the future is not to strike and go out and starve, something that workers in the late 19th century and early 20th were quite familiar with, but to strike and remain in and take possession of the necessary property of production. If anyone is to starve, let it be the capitalist class. Just 1 year later, 3,000 workers organized by the IWW staged a 65-hour factory occupation at General Electric's Schenectady, New York plant. But it would really take another generation before this tactic would become generalized and an effective part of American labor mobilization. So in brief, I would say that syndicalism is the theory and factory occupations are the practice. And moreover, like this is a form of self-radicalizing, self-educating practice. So if in some ways, we're going to borrow from Les Mis for a second for our visuals. If in some ways, as Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels put it in Capital, the factory experience taught alienation to workers. And I'm substituting female pronouns because of the workforce. We find that the worker is compelled to sell not a commodity, but her own labor power as a commodity. This is because she finds on the other side, opposed to her and confronting her as alien property, all the means of production, all the material conditions of work together. In other words, all material wealth confronts the worker as the property of the commodity possessor, right? So you have this like factory owner that you experience the factory as a class adversary, but who seems to encapsulate the means of production. Well, that's not what happens during sit-downs. It's exactly what shifts. And so these photos from the GM strike during the 36 to 39 strike wave shows this very different embodied relationship to the means of production. And this is from journalist Louise Adamich writing about sit-down strikes in general. Quote, sitting by their machines, cauldrons, boilers, and workbenches, they talked. Some realized, this is during a moment of interruption, for the first time how important they were in the process of rubber production. 12 men had practically stopped the works. Almost any dozen or score of them could do it. And so like this kind of experience becomes the thing that anarcho-syndicalists, council communists, CIO organizers, IWW organizers are interested in people carrying out and experiencing. This is how Dutch council communist Anton Pannekoek will talk about this, that like this becoming conscious of your ultimate connection with the shop, that it's not another man's building, like we saw in the Marx quote, but rather a place where they can feel they should be entirely the master of production, that they ought to expel these unworthy outsiders, these interloping capitalists who are abusing them and the riches of the earth. And so like syndicalism ends up having this like theory of radicalization. Okay, let me switch gears and talk about the place of direct action tactics in the state-centered revolutions in Bolivia, because this is a place where in 1952, in alliance with the workers, the National Revolutionary Party National Revolutionary Movement comes to power. And its initial like sort of three claims are universal suffrage, nationalization of the mines, and agrarian reform, which is to say expulsion of landlords from rural areas. And so it's through like mass militias that are empowered by this revolution that the nationalization of the mines is carried out. And there's a kind of like elaborate ceremonial process of like joint state labor reclamation of the mines. And after a 16-month period of uprisings in rural areas, many of which directly expelled landlords, this consolidation of that property shift through the agrarian reform decree of August 1953. And so you have these moments where these really profound reforms are being carried out on a direct action basis and then kind of certified by their state allies. The other thing that comes out of this in this powerful way, I'm sort of building the Bolivian case because, man, is there a lot of retrenchment that is also happening as well, including before the formal issuing of this constitution in 1967. But what is created in Bolivia is a right to unionization, a right to strike, and a right to a fuero sindical, which has a kind of like, the fuero is a medieval legal concept that said that certain sectors of society in that time, like church members, members of certain guilds, other things like this, were outside the law for their particular practices and were not subject to criminal prosecution. The fuero sindical is this new novel thing that's still quite socially important in Bolivia, reaffirmed by some laws in the 21st century, that says that union leaders cannot be prosecuted for their actions as union leaders. I don't know, there's 3 or 4 other states that have some version of the fuero sindical, but it's extremely rare. Globally, it's like the kind of furthest reaches of the recognition of the right to strike. One more switching of places. So then we have Poland. This is actually Russia, to be clear. You got Lenin up here. And this shift is going to happen in the Soviet sphere between 1917, when we have elected representatives of the workers who are supposed to make binding decisions in 1917, and then in 1920, no trade union groups are directly intervene in industrial management. So like the Soviet system cottons on to a one-person management system within there's 3 years, and then it's going to end up imposing that one person management system in Poland, where there is a syndicalist-ish tradition of workers' councils that is part of the resistance to the Nazi occupation that flowers in 1944 and 45, but then by 46 and 47 is being replaced by these like PPR-led, which is the state party-led labor leaders who are put in this role of executing labor discipline. And yet, it's still a worker state, right? Not only so, like this gives all this space in 1980 for an opposition movement to come into its own to say, you know what we're not doing? Politics. What we are doing is trade union representation. We need all of these rights within the factory, within this economic sphere. You guys can have politics. We understand that, like, the Soviet Union would be very upset if we were political opponents of you, but we are economic opponents of you, demanding the right, as enshrined in the Polish Constitution, to free union representation. And so there's this dialogue that's happening both practically, like, what does it mean to occupy this space? Does it mean to occupy the big-ass shipyards as a space of radicalization, of power, as a place where, man, you cannot just be shot down in the streets because there's a lot of expensive equipment and you're not super replaceable, but also as a place where there's sort of a carving out of a separate sphere, literally over a negotiating table with the Polish national government. Okay, so big picture, what we have is these moments of, on the one hand, states that are forced to reckon with a non-liberal form of collective action. And rather than many of these states had previously been antagonists of the labor movement, they illegalized union activity, they mandated return to work, they sometimes violently attack strikers, but then they sit down when they've come to this moment of realizing these states aren't going away. And I would argue that they come to treat them in the same way that Foucault describes treating the population as a kind of thick natural phenomenon that cannot be changed, or at least not dissolved by decree. And they have to manage the population and the labor force by adjudicating which collective actions are legitimate, legalizing workers' associations as proper channels of action, and regulating the methods that workers can use in struggle, right? And so, like, this is super complicated. It feels like the state is taking steps back, but they're also shaping the handcuffs that will go on official union representatives. This is a very, like, complicated form of interaction, but it is a shift from antagonism to channeling and creating a hegemonic framework of contention. And then from below, these actual processes of negotiation, rights claiming, and legal defense very much complicate the purity of the syndicalist story of direct action. Because, man, is there a lot of negotiation. They tie autonomous action to recognition by adversaries, and they deal with the fact that, like, what is direct action is sort of bound up in the what is already legal question. The way that we got free speech in the American labor movement is IWW free speech campaigns. So their direct action was standing on a soapbox, right? Because that was criminal. And then when they did it enough and filled the jails and all these kind of things, then eventually the US government was able to concede to its entire public the right to that kind of public speech. Similarly, when there are these negotiations and acknowledgement of unions, you have to win the agreement at the end of your strike. You end up on a bargaining table where you're saying, will you recognize us or criminalize us? Will you agree to a binding contract on which we can come back and pursue this or not? And so the pure autonomy of the concept of direct action is put into real complicated tension by any kind of successful agreement at the end of a strike. And so what I would ultimately argue is that if the factory occupation is in some ways like this ultimate expression of like what is direct action, what is autonomy, and so on, that it's also the case that the agreement is a place where like that autonomy is put into complicated and inevitably tension-filled relationship with principles of representation and integration with the state, at least in so long as we have them.
All right, thank you, Thomas. We've got on 20 minutes, so there's time for questions for Carwill.
Yes.
Back to more the first part of the presentation, you came from a general strike to the concept or the strategy of factory occupations.
Yeah.
And I asked myself, is it that the strategy of factory occupations is in fact development or the next step from the concept of general strike, in the sense of that general strike is a practice, of course, but it's also kind of literal sense of that it's a kind of total concept on whole society, whereas occupations or factories is much more direct and practical. So I asked myself if factory occupation is the next step or the next logical step out of this more like global concept of general strike. I don't know if it's understand.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And I feel like my very tactically oriented history of research, right, makes me feel like some general strikes that are involving occupying the entire city's workplaces are like, it's a step up to go to like everyone's workplaces instead of just a few. On the other hand, if you think about like Poland in 70 and 76 have these like citywide protests, general strike-ish outside of the factories, and they find themselves in this big tactical deficit, a little bit different than what Lucy Parsons is describing, where they're outside, they're not protected by factory walls, they're subject to the elements, they're subject to beatings and tear gas. And so by like moving inside of the factory walls, they put themselves next to this really valuable equipment, to be blunt about it, and make themselves able to be kind of a different, more like elaborate kind of fighting force than they had been before. And I think like that moment with like Lucy Parsons quotes is a way of thinking through like some of the practical benefits, right? To not sit out and starve, but rather have a place and to not be replaceable, right? So that like in a context like the United States, where there's a lot of strike breaking and private security and other things, to like have a secure base against that was, I think, like kind of daring advance.
Okay, we've got a question from Stefan. First,
thank you very much. A very interesting paper. I have a question on Bolivia, about which I know very little. But if I understood you correctly, you said that some indigenous groups criticized politics as a colonial imposition.
Yeah.
Could you say a bit more about that? So, what kind of indigenous cosmologies were involved, and did they have a different concept of participation? And what was the idea that, so to speak, was replacing?
Yeah, this is worth a good chunk of attention, right? And Bolivia does have a like anarcho-syndicalist tradition that's lurking in the past and is in some ways like Catarismo is in some ways a child of both a kind of indigenous collective vision of the village, which is very based in assembly-based democracy, but also in so like there are meetings, but also a rotational role. So the indigenous social form that people are defending in that is one where people in sort of traditional like Highland indigenous self-governance are they have a role in the community, and there's a bunch of roles. In order to advance through the series of roles, you have to like show up as like prototypically as a like adult couple, right? Through which you advance through these roles. And so there's a like gender complementarity story about it, which I'm not going to get into its virtues and flaws, and a story about like each time you go through like an annual cycle to come into a new role of responsibility, whether it's for land or for like representing the community to outsiders or parting certain traditions, other things like that. You have to demonstrate it to the community that you will be selfless in your actions, right? And so I literally have an article on this, right? So like this is about this opposition between forms of organization, which they would describe as organic, like inwardly built within the community that have all of these ethics of like reciprocity and selflessness and all that, and which are meaningfully, I think, performed in the ways that leaders ask their community for the right to assume a new role, which includes like head of the campesino union for the village. And the political, which they describe as like connected to this external state, presumably non-indigenous, in which I think there's a lot of built-up experience of co-option, bribery, self-dealing, like the problem of leaders who are on the take, right? And there's actually there are a couple words in Quechua and in Aymara that are used to describe those people, right? They're like sucked up, basically, what they mean, and like corrupt. Right? And so there's like an indigenous philosophy of don't lie, don't steal, and don't be sucked up. Right. And but it's in Quechua, so it sounds better. So there's a kind of ethic of like, oh, we know that in our experience, when people have gone off and joined political parties, they like exhibit all these tendencies. They suddenly are receiving money for themselves and not for the community. They are disloyal. They are all these things. And so kind of Padrismo's, and this is, I think, a more general ethic, honestly, in Bolivia right now, like a lot of people cotton onto this kind of perspective of skepticism of politics. Yeah, that's the story that they're telling. So it's a violation of like kind of fundamental values that have to deal with like the difference between individualism and communitarianism. I would say that like this version of indigeneity is not millennial. It's not thousands of years old. It's a version of indigeneity that emerges when, in the colonial context, an existing hierarchical indigenous political structure in the Inca Empire and its various other competitors are entirely displaced, and what's left as the indigenous sphere is the local rural community. And so there are like mostly indigenous, but some Spanish cultural references they're like playing out in that world, and yet like there's a really strong ethical stance. And there's a whole other level of like, how does the first indigenous aligned the political party end up describing itself as like a weird kind of tool through which the organic can hold the political while like containing its sort of bad tendencies. And that's why it's called the political instrument for the sovereignty of the peoples. And there's a debate about whether it's really that, right? But yeah.